I'm Matt at Nexus Baseball, and this is episode 44 of the Tommy John Epidemic. This series is a YouTube read of content from the book Plague of the Gods, an outsider's perspective on baseball's Tommy John Epidemic, which is available now on Amazon. I decided to put this content on YouTube to make the material as accessible as possible. This series examines the science behind the most superhuman action the human body can produce, accelerating a baseball up to 100 miles per hour. Change is hard in any context, but often harder when there are deeply entrenched traditions and systems. The reason for change is obvious: to keep both professional and amateur pitchers healthy while maintaining the high level of athleticism and competition in the game. Now that we have identified the anatomy and process to throw the baseball safely and effectively, how can this process be implemented into the game at the major league level? The biggest changes will have to occur in pitcher instruction and what teams should value in a pitcher. This requires a mental shift away from immediate results and an enhanced focus on process. Baseball knows that training effective players is a painstaking process of gradually increasing complexity and challenge, which is why there are more levels to the minor leagues than the development leagues of any other professional sport. For most pitchers by this point, however, the team treats their mechanics as mostly set and seeks only to make as minimal changes as possible to enhance effectiveness as they move up the ranks. They rarely make significant changes to how the pitcher executes his craft, primarily for fear of reducing the effectiveness already present. It is usually only when a pitcher struggles in terms of their on-field results that minor changes begin to be made. Major League Baseball needs to take better ownership of the health of their players, developing pitchers that not only project to be competitive at a major league level, but also have the best chance of maintaining their health for years to come. This will mean recognizing incorrect and dangerous mechanics and methods and making necessary changes. This is in the team's best interest, as there are massive financial costs due to pitching injuries, in addition to the human impact on the players themselves. This does not mean that pitchers cannot and should not be throwing hard and competitively, nor does it mean cookie-cutter mechanics. It is simply that there needs to be a baseline set of best practices based on science and anatomy that create certain safety landmarks to build off of. Steps are already moving in the direction for this to occur. Most major league teams have already set up some form of sport training institute and have hired coaches to better investigate and implement more comprehensive training programs. Additionally, teams are more willing than ever before to try new approaches, including opening pitchers, allowing pitchers to try new techniques, and use outside assistance, most recently from the team at Driveline Baseball. Baseball has never been more open to new and different ideas. But how are mechanical changes best taught and implemented? It can't be overemphasized how important it is to build the small building block movement chains and the mobility required to achieve them, before adding on greater complexity. The challenge with this approach is that it again goes so firmly against the trends of modern sport training. Mobility work and muscular control work aren't as sexy as building show muscles, putting up weights like beating a video game high score, or seeing immediate increases in velocity from throwing using cheats. We live in a society that overlooks process in favor of results, attention to detail in favor of expediency, and are firmly in the always entertain generation. The trick is to communicate the benefits of each part of the process to create understanding and buy-in to the benefits of the program. It's a lot like teaching math to children. Without an understanding of its application, it's simply an abstract that comes off as useless and boring. Part of the way to create buy-in is to validate training methods by continuing the process of scientific experimentation. This should be conducted in a systematic manner to look at in detail and in larger populations the anatomical interactions discussed. Once the pitcher has bought into the program, it must be taught in a manner that balances effectiveness with maintaining interest and intensity. One of the larger trends in sports training over the last 20 years is the application of the Bernstein principle. This principle postulates that the body will organize itself automatically with the overall goal of the activity. For example, if you attempt to throw the baseball, your body will fire the muscles in sequence to accomplish the task without having to think or be mentally cued to do so. A derivation of this is intent training that further postulates that activity should be completed with maximum effort or intent for the body to complete this reorganization for maximum force. These concepts build off the fundamental role of practice as part of the basis of all athletic training, being based on repetitive training with the goal of making motions instinctive. These are seemingly intuitive conclusions, as a pitcher cannot think about activating every muscle in their body individually in the pitching motion. It simply occurs too quickly, and the body needs to utilize trained patterns to accomplish it. How these concepts are implemented into baseball training is flawed, however, as although the body is smart enough to react on instinct to accomplish a task, it will always do so using the path of least resistance. This will emphasize all the proclivities of the athlete, whether positive or negative. This can be particularly counterproductive when the body doesn't possess the needed range of motion, or when certain muscle groups and neuromuscular connections are much more dominant than others. I'm a perfect example of this, as when I started pitching, I was already a strong athlete and was throwing with the intent to blow a hole through the pitching target about a foot wide. This approach overemphasized my strengths and did not address my inherent weaknesses in the range of motion of my shoulder due to my trap and deltoids, my overactive and tight lat muscles, and my overuse of the powerful flexor muscles. It wasn't until I addressed these issues using mobility training, ART, and worked on building motor control building blocks that my velocity went up significantly and in direct proportion to my reduction in exertion. Rather than teaching intent training as an undirected maximum effort approach, it must be developed in individual levels, known as scaffolding in the education field. Also known as a pyramid approach, the lowest level of training is single muscle activation, or developing the ability of the body to send signals to individual components and differentiate one component from another. Load is not required in these motor control activities at this level. The body can contract each muscle under just the load of gravity. Muscular control is always a positive, and the greater the control on the lowest level, the greater the control will be at the higher. These individual muscles should then be built up to next in the next level as small chains, or blocks of muscles that function collectively. Usually this will take the form of a targeted muscle movement and the associated muscles that provide stability or range of motion. It is at this point that resistance can be introduced to strengthen the bond between the brain and the muscle while executing this activation. At one level higher, these building blocks can increase in complexity and evolve to what is commonly termed drills, or basic skills execution tasks. Without the previous building blocks, it is likely that the drill would simply reinforce bad habits. It is not enough to get an athlete to mime out a motion. They must feel the motion through their neuromuscular connection. Otherwise, when they complete it, it might look correct to the naked eye, but could be using the wrong muscle groups or stabilizers. The final level is the pitching motion itself, at which point the goal is not to stop reinforcing the lower levels of the pyramid, as it is easy to fall into suboptimal patterns. Instead, all levels of the pyramid should be trained and practiced. One of the reasons players often go through hot periods and cold periods is that something small at a lower level often isn't working as expected, but the player has a hard time nailing it down. The most consistent players are the ones that don't overlook the fundamentals, but instead return to them, particularly if they're struggling. The goal should be to head off this up and down process, preventing bad habits from being created by attention to detail and training the lower levels of the pyramid equally. Due to the recovery necessary from the actual activity of pitching, pitchers frequently have a lot of time on their hands. Usually a starting pitcher will make a start, have an off day with light tossing or weights, a bullpen of less than 30 minutes the following day, light tossing or weights again, and then a start on the fifth day. Other than working with the catchers on strategy, watching tape, and strength and conditioning work, the schedule is not very demanding. It is even less so for relief pitchers, who pitch an inning every 2 to 3 days and do light tossing and resistance training in between to keep ready. Pitchers should instead be spending a lot more time working on fundamental motor control movements, as well as recovery and soft tissue work, including ART, to maximize their safety and capabilities. Join me for episode 45 next week. Remember, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Your support makes this work possible. Also, if you want to jump ahead, please consider picking up the book on Amazon from the link in the description below. See you next week.